Caught them cheating at my mother's funeral. I didn't hesitate and took action. The rain kept tapping on the funeral parlor's windows like a drumbeat, counting down the moment of truth. People murmured in the pews, their faces half hidden under black veils of mourning and speculation. I stood near the casket, hands clasped so hard that my knuckles turned white, watching the floral arrangements tremble with each gust of wind that slid through the door. The room smelled of wilted lilies and old secrets. I wasn't supposed to be paying attention to anyone but my mother, who lay inside the polished box with a serene expression that betrayed none of the storms that had roiled her life in the last year. Her death wasn't sudden, but it felt sudden to me, as if the final page of a long, heavy book had been slammed shut and left me to absorb the residue of the story alone. The first crack appeared when a woman I'd known as Aunt Margaret leaned in to whisper to my sister, Lila. The whispers floated like moths, skimming over the surface of the room, but I caught the scent of something sharper than condolences in the air. I turned away from the silent tribute to notice a man I'd never trusted masquerading as a cousin, his eyes glinting with a cruel light as he spoke in a tone that suggested he believed himself unseen. That moment felt like a trapdoor opening beneath the floor of my family's history. The room's silence amplified the click of a text notification on my phone, the kind of message that never comes at a funeral unless someone is pretending to mourn while secretly counting profits or calculating a score. The text read, in clipped, brutal words, "I know what you did." The sender had no name, only the implication that someone had used my mother's death as cover for a lie I'd carried far too long. I didn't hesitate. Not when the past had finally walked into the present wearing a suit and the mask of a grieving relative. I stepped away from the casket and slid through the crowd with a purpose that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The hallway outside the parlor was dim, lit by a single stubborn bulb that hummed like a tired bee. I paused at the door, listening to the muffled sounds from the service inside, the soft thud of a priest's wooden gavel, the quiet crying of a cousin who had always pretended to be above it all. The person I believed had orchestrated the deceit stood near a vending machine, pretending to take a phone call, but really watching the room like a hunter watches a clearing. It was him, the man who had always insinuated that our family's pain could be bought, that our mother's memory could be made into a profitable narrative for someone else's gain. The same man who had shown a chilling kindness to my mother when it suited him, then vanished when the truth got heavy. I stepped closer, every step measured, the floor's grain biting into the sole of my shoe as if trying to remind me to stay grounded, to stay quiet. The sound of the vending machine hissed and his voice dropped into a conspiratorial whisper as he spoke into the phone, unaware of the storm that would soon erupt behind him. I could feel the air thinning around me, a prelude to a revelation that would either save us or ruin us. "Do you know what you've done to her?" I hissed, crossing the distance between us with the cold precision of a surgeon preparing for a final incision. He jumped, almost dropping his phone, and his eyes widened as if he'd forgotten to wear the mask of innocence. He turned slowly, as if facing a jury rather than a person who had every right to judge him. The lie curled on his lips, but I didn't give him the chance to spit it out. I spoke instead with a calm that surprised even me. "The affair," I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth but precise, "was never about passion. It was about leverage, about control, about using a moment of weakness to confirm a plan that was already in motion." I paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle between us. "Tell me the truth now, before that truth costs more people their sleep tonight." His mouth opened, closed, opened again, and finally a sigh escaped, a confession that came in fits and starts, as if he were peeling an old stubborn label from a bottle. The words spilled out in a torrent, the hush money, the staged appearances, the way the truth had been manipulated to push people toward a particular outcome. He spoke of fear, the fear of losing money, status, a life that he believed he'd earned through sheer nerve and a willingness to break the rules. He admitted the details that had kept us all hostage to a narrative that didn't belong to us. The admission hit me like a cold wind. But I didn't let the moment become a melodrama, not here, not now. The funeral inside was a ceremony of memory and mourning, and the family needed something steadier than vengeance. I needed to see what happened next. the way a single action could ripple through a life stacked with secrets as tall as the family's pride. I stepped back and studied him, not with the fury of a scorned lover, but with the clear-eyed gaze of someone who'd spent years cataloging lies and their consequences. If I chose to expose him now, the room would erupt into a chorus of outrage, defensiveness, and perhaps an ugly kind of justice that felt more like spectacle than truth. If I chose restraint, the cost would be borne by the very people we swore to protect, the vulnerable, the ones who'd been harmed by this web of deceit in quiet, unseen ways. The moment required a different kind of courage, not the loud public act that would turn the funeral into a theater of retribution, but a precise surgical strike that could protect those who could be hurt the most. My mother's memory deserved that. I stepped away from him and headed toward the elevator bank, where a handful of relatives waited to leave the building. The room's air grew thinner as I moved, each breath a reminder that life was fragile and revelation could be a weapon as much as a remedy. In the elevator, I found Lila waiting, her eyes wide with questions and the sort of fear that only comes from recognizing that a family's narrative is about to fracture in a way that can't be repaired. "Who was it?" she asked in a whisper that trembled with both curiosity and dread. "The truth," I said, offering a grave, almost ceremonial smile, "isn't a weapon to be waved in anger. It's a responsibility to bear with care." But even as the words left my mouth, I felt the ache of knowing that responsibility rarely comes without cost. We re-entered the funeral parlor to the soft murmur of people who had not yet scattered, a few lingering to offer condolences to the mother who had just left them with a lifetime of questions. I watched as Aunt Margaret pressed a tissue to her eyes, the gesture heavy with feigned sorrow, while the cousin who'd always posed as the family's moral compass looked away, perhaps fearing that the truth would erase the stable world she'd built in the shadow of our mother's illness. My plan was simple, or so it seemed. Reveal nothing publicly for the moment, but secure the documents, messages, and any corroborating evidence in a place of trust where they could be reviewed by the family's closest allies, people who cared more about protecting the vulnerable than preserving appearances. The goal wasn't revenge, but redress. A way to ensure that whoever had encouraged the deception wouldn't be free to hurt anyone else's life later down the line. As we moved to the living room for the wake that followed the service, I kept a steady pace, a quiet hum of resolve running beneath my skin. My father, silent, stoic, and usually absent in moments like this, stepped forward with a look that was almost approving, a rare moment of shared purpose between us that told me I wasn't alone in this decision. The others, however, wore their confusion like heavy cloaks, muttering apologies that sounded hollow and insufficient. The night drew on, and the room filled with the soft clink of glasses, the awkward chafing of chairs, and the low murmur of conversations that tried to sound intimate, but only highlighted the distance between people who had grown apart. In these moments, the fear of consequence can feel more paralyzing than the truth itself. I watched the family navigate the chasm between spectacle and sincerity, between the ritual of mourning and the honesty that threatened to pull us all apart. The next morning, I woke with a sense of inevitability. The truth wasn't a single dramatic confession at the funeral. It was a careful, deliberate process of collecting, corroborating, and planning. There were allies to recruit, logistics to secure, and a path to walk that would minimize collateral damage while maximizing the chance of justice for those affected. It was a counterintuitive choice, to protect the vulnerable by not immediately broadcasting the full truth, allowing the family to confront it in a controlled, compassionate way, rather than in a melodrama that could traumatize the mourner's memory of the mother. In the days that followed, the family began to crack in the exact ways that truth-tellers fear most. The eldest aunt, who had long posed as the moral center of the clan, started fumbling for excuses, her perfect mask slipping as she realized the scandal would inevitably reach the surface. The cousin who loved to narrate everyone's misdeeds found herself suddenly unsure of how to spin the story to keep the audience's sympathy on her side. And the man at the heart of it all found himself cornered by a growing circle of confidants who refused to allow him to control the narrative any longer. There were moments of quiet, intimate confrontations, a whispered conversation in a kitchen that could not contain its anger, a steely press conference with a lawyer who laid out the consequences of deceit, A walk through a park where our mother's favorite bench offered a place to reflect on what had been hidden and what needed to be faced. The process wasn't glamorous. It was painstaking, methodical, and often painful. But the alternative, public shaming and a family torn to pieces, felt infinitely worse. As the weeks passed, the truth began to surface in layers, not all at once. Some aspects were revealed through careful document reviews, others through the recollections of people who had witnessed the early subtle signs of betrayal. The family learned to grieve not only for the mother they had lost, but also for the innocence that had died long before her passing. The sense that the people closest to them could be trusted to tell the whole truth, always. In time, the family found a way to redefine what justice could look like in the wake of a funeral that had become a battleground of secrets. The person who had caused so much harm was confronted with the consequences of his choices in a setting that allowed for accountability, without reducing the mother's memory to a mere headlines. The nursing home where the mother had spent her last months, an institution that had seen countless small acts of kindness and moments of tenderness, was honored in a memorial that emphasized care, memory, and the protection of those who could not defend themselves. I learned something essential through the ordeal. Taking action is not a single explosive act. It is a sustained commitment to truth, to those who have suffered, and to the memory of someone who deserved more from the world than the silence it often rewards. The action I chose, careful, strategic, and anchored in the protection of the vulnerable, was not about vengeance. It was about reestablishing a boundary. You don't exploit grief, you don't gamble with the truth, and you don't pretend that a life lived for appearances is a life lived for anything other than self-preservation. The funeral's memory eventually settled into a new kind of quiet truth. The room that had once felt crowded with judgment and fear now carried a different weight. A weight that came from knowing the truth had been faced, but in a way that allowed healing to begin. My mother's memory remained intact, not as a symbol for scandal, but as a beacon for those who would take responsibility for their actions, even in the most painful moments. In the end, I stood on the porch of the family home, watching the sun rise over a street that had once seemed claustrophobic with secrets. The world felt lighter, not because the truth had erased the past, but because it had finally allowed us to move forward with integrity, even if that integrity came at a great personal cost. I didn't hesitate, nor did I revel in the chaos I could have unleashed. I chose a path of measured, principled action, one that honored the memory of the mother who had given so much and deserved a family that would fight for what was right without sinking into the spectacle of destruction. The story doesn't pretend to offer easy answers. It acknowledges the messy, unforgiving realities of family, grief, and accountability. It asks what it means to do the right thing when the world wants spectacle, and it answers with a quiet rule. Truth, once faced with courage and care, can be a shield as well as a sword. If the audience leaves with a knot in their stomach and a heavy breath, that is the echo of a life lived and a choice made with intention, even at a funeral. Fim.